for coming today for what I hope will be a really interesting discussion, presentation, and then a discussion with the audience. My name is Lloyd Russell Moyle. I'm the Member of Parliament for Brighton, Kemp Town and Peacehaven, and I'm a Labour and Cooperative member, and also I chair the APPG, the all-party parliamentary group for the Syrian Kurds and Rojava, and I'm the vice chair for the APPG for the Kurds in Turkey and vice chair for the APPG for Kurds in Iran, and member of the APPG for the Kurdish regional government. So hopefully I cover and I have an interest in the Kurdish question more broadly. What we are here today to particularly talk about is the future of Syria and the autonomous region that has been created in Syria. I visited earlier on in the year, and we were due to go back in 3 weeks' time. Unfortunately, Brexit has got in the way of our parliamentary delegation, but we will make a commitment to return with other MPs and Lords on the corridor via KRG into Rojava, which we used last time, and is an important corridor of connection that we must continue to unite. But today we have Vladimir, who's going to talk to us about some of the work that he has been doing, and particularly of interest, the book that is due to be published, I think it is, that you have been working on, which is around the Syrian Kurds experiment with self-rule. And this is something that really fascinated me when I visited there. We've heard a lot, those of us that have read, about kind of the theoretical teachings of kind of democratic confederalism and how it maybe is in theory, but actually seeing some of those things starting in practice and some of the flaws, of course, along that journey. Let's not pretend that everything is rose-tinted on the journey to nirvana. But there is a progress there that is happening that is very interesting for us as democratic socialists, myself and others, to make sure that we support. Vladimir has got a very good background and record. I see that his first degree is of an excellent subject, conflict studies, the same as my first degree. I got it from Bradford University, you have got it from Utrecht University, which was also an extremely good peace and conflict studies department that I visited many times when I then worked at Bradford University. So you come from good stock, and then Exeter University, of course, focusing on Kurdish studies. So I think that I should say probably not much more, and probably should hand over to you, Vladimir. What we will do is we will hear a bit from yourself, if you don't mind, and then we will try and have a discussion with the audience, which I hope will be quite fruitful. I will cluster comments and questions in probably 2 or 3s, and we will go on so long as we have time and have the room. So, without further ado, Vladimir.
Yeah, well, my name is Vladimir. I've been going to the Kurdish area since 2009, when I first went to Kurdistan region of Iraq. When the Syrian crisis started and it was possible to visit northeast of Syria, Rojava, I went there several times. Actually, I was there a few days ago. Actually, I came back when Turkey threatened to attack the northeast of Syria. And now I was preparing for this presentation, and now we have this weird statement by the Trump administration that they're gonna pull out in a soon indefinite period. So yeah, that's really messes up my presentation a little bit, but it opens a lot of room for questions and answers. I'm not sure if I can answer all of those. So yeah, I first wanted to talk about the new system they established there. So a lot of people still think it's like a federal system, but actually they were moving towards like establishing a system called Autonomous Administration of the North and the East of Syria. So a lot of people, they still talk about that this is Rojava, this is Rojava. No, like this idea of just Rojava, which is just Kurdish areas of Syria, it has transformed into the northeast of Syria, because the Kurds now and Arabs and other minorities, they have like this system together. And the north of Syria, which doesn't only include Kurds, like if you look to the demographics, it's not just Kurds. And it's impossible in this area to create like sort of a Kurdistan region of Syria, like what we have in Iraq, where you have a dominantly Kurdish majority area. While in Syria, even in, for instance, the province of Hasaka, you have a lot of Kurds, but it's very mixed with Arabs and Christians and other minorities. So it was like a good step that they made this year to create this system, which is not on an ethnic basis, and it also follows this ideology of confederalism, or what they always say in the Democratic Nation Project. So it's not based just on creating like a Kurdish state. The idea was like sort of to create like a federal entity for all the people living in that area. And the reason they could create this because they had US support against ISIS. And what we see now that this is not going that well anymore, because Trump wants to withdraw, but I will come to that point later. So yeah, I've been visiting this area for a long time, and one of the things that always annoys me when talking about the northeast of Syria, that people always compare it to a democracy that we have in the UK, or we have in Europe, we have in the US. Like, you should compare the northeast of Syria to the rest of Syria. If you compare the northeast of Syria to the regime area, it is a paradise. If you compare it to the Turkish controlled areas, it's a paradise. And it's not perfect. There's a lot of flaws that have to be addressed. But if you compare it inside Syria itself, and even to some of its neighbors like Turkey, where like Turkey is, for instance, always talking about criticizing what's going on in this area, but you see in Turkey itself that there's like lots of people in prison, there's a lot of journalists in prison. I mean, Turkey is not like the best example to criticize. For instance, they don't have the right to criticize the Kurds of Syria, because if you look to Turkey itself, like what went on in Turkey itself with ethnic cleansing, for instance, in the 1990s, when they torched a lot of villages in the southeast of Turkey, they're not the most best example. And the same is with the regime. And if you actually now look to the northeast of Syria, you can see actually a lot of foreign journalists, NGOs that are actually quite critical of the administration, that actually are supporting the Syrian opposition. I'm talking about Western journalists that are actually very critical of the PYD or the YPG. They're actually able to access this area. But if you would be, for instance, critical of Turkey, first of all, you will be banned from Turkey. Second of all, you will not be able to visit the areas under Turkish control. There's no Western journalists almost that go to the areas under Turkish control. And with the regime, it's almost the same. If you're critical of the regime, if you went, for instance, to the opposition-held areas, you will not be able to visit the regime-held areas. But in the northeast of Syria, it's different. If you went to the regime areas, the Kurds are not going to say there, you're not allowed to enter the northeast of Syria. If you go, for instance, to the opposition-held areas, they will not tell a journalist that went to these areas like you're not allowed. But for instance, if you go, for instance, you want to go to the opposition areas and you went to, not that it's even possible, because most likely you will be kidnapped by some jihadist group. But let's say if it will be possible, they will not be very happy that you visited the Kurdish held areas. So like, it's not fully democratic. It's like sort of an experiment which is still developing. Although we have to see now if this current decision to withdraw, if this is going to continue. But anyway, like in the past, at least it was, if you compare to other areas, it was sort of a paradise. I mean, there were like so many NGOs that were operating there. Foreigners were going there without being afraid of being arrested or targeted. So it's really like, you know, you had religious freedom there. Like I recently visited, for instance, the church in Kobani. You had like Kurdish Muslims that converted to Christianity, and nobody was saying anything why you're converting. And even in Damascus, this is not possible. And so like this is the situation that you see actually on the ground, and it's sort of a frustration now that to see, for instance, this new Trump decision. Because if you look, for instance, in the northeast of Syria, you had the Syrian Democratic Forces, which were established with US support in 2015. So this had like sort of a unified command structure. But if you look, for instance, to the Turkish-held areas, you have different rebel groups that are all fighting each other from time to time. There's not really stability. And Turkey wanted to actually export this model, what they have in Jarablus, in Al-Bab, and Afrin, to the east of the Euphrates. So the SDF, they didn't accept to have like two security forces. So that's not like the most democratic example, but at the same time you prevent like infighting. We all know that the Iraqi Kurds in the 1990s fought a brutal civil war against each other. And at least in the northeast of Syria, you don't have this, because the SDF said we want to have one command. So this made it like sort of effective. This made it also an effective partner of the US, because the SDF had no elements that were cooperating, for instance, with jihadist groups. They had no elements working with Nusra. There were like a lot of rebel groups that were basically getting weapons from the Americans and selling them to Al-Qaeda or giving them to Al-Qaeda. So they never had this issue, and actually Western journalists were not able to visit the rebel-held areas anymore, I think since 2014 or 2015. It was becoming more difficult because the risk of kidnapping was too high. But in the northeast of Syria, in this autonomous administration area, you never had this issue. And even you could go to Kobani and have a drink, you can have a beer as an NGO worker. But can you imagine doing the same, for instance, in Al-Bab or in Jarablus? That's not possible. I mean, in Damascus, it's a different thing. You have to be very pro-Assad to be allowed in that area. But I don't think there was this specific issue in the northeast of Syria. Another issue is that what I've seen also with my personal experience, like because they had this very central command structure, and because they have like a more ideological framework, is that there was like really not a lot of looting or corruption or this kind of issues. So for instance, I saw myself that there was a media official that had like 2 jobs secretly, and he got fired because he had like secretly was trying to get more money by having a second job, and the administration fired him. And also there were other people that were basically imprisoned because they were involved in corruption. And you know, in the region, this is really something strange that you have like such a strong system that combats corruption, because if you look to Turkey, Iran, or the rest of the region, you know, with all this oil money especially, there's a lot of issues of corruption. So they have built like a very strong system for with anti-corruption. And you see this also with, they even have like a military disciplinary police, which basically check for these things, which could be maybe the same as a military police in some countries. And I remember when I was, for instance, in Hasakah, there was a huge fight between the regime and the Kurds. And after that, some civilians started looting areas that were previously held by the regime in Hasakah. Actually, the commander that was there in the area, she told her fighters, like, stop this looting now, stop it. So they have like a real strong system. Apart from that, you also have successfully recruitment of locals. So we've seen a lot of, for instance, I was recently stopped at a checkpoint in a Kurdish town, and the person who stopped me was Arabic. So it was like a Kurdish majority town, but the security police was Arabic. So that shows that they even trust Arabs enough to basically police Kurdish majority cities in the Hasakah province. And it also shows that there's really a wrong description in the media that this is just like a Kurdish system. Like, it's not anymore a Kurdish system. Like, if you go now to the front line in Hajin, there's a lot of Arabs that are fighting against ISIS. But even you see this so far going the system that they're trying to include all Arabs and other minorities into the system, that you even can see that, for instance, in a town like, for instance, Amuda, close to Amuda, and other towns that you have like sort of an Arab police, which is quite strange even for Kurds, because they are like, what the hell is this Arab doing in our town, and we have to pass their checkpoint. So that's like sort of the system that they made, that even some Kurds are sometimes like, there actually were some Kurds that were upset with the system because they're like, why we're giving so much space to Arabs in our area and we cannot trust them. But the system is working towards inclusion of all these groups. But it's also true that in the end, many of the commanders and the political leaders are still Kurdish. But if you look, for instance, to the councils in Manbij and Raqqa and other areas, there is a sort of mix of a system. You have Arabs, you have people from the local society. Well, for instance, if you look to the areas controlled by Turkey, like in Afrin, there's almost no Kurdish participation in the local councils. And for instance, I was in Raqqa, and you do have like people that, for instance, I've seen people that are pro-regime, there are people pro-opposition that are part of the Raqqa Civil Council and are now working with the SDF and the Syrian Democratic Council to basically rule Raqqa city. So it's not like what people say that it's like a purely Kurdish project. It's not really like that. But it started in the beginning like that in 2012 and 2013 when they first started to take over areas. They had this deal with the Kurdish National Council, which is backed by the Kurdistan Regional Government. They had this sort of Rojava project at that time. But now this is not really feasible anymore because they have expanded to such an extent that it's like a very mixed area. Also, like I told you about the institution building, so they have really built a lot of institutions, which makes it very effective. For instance, with dealing with NGOs, with dealing with institutions. They also have conscription, so this really, the conscription, a lot of people don't like it. It also creates like immigration, but at the same time it really helps to have all the people participate in the system. There were a lot of issues about education recently because there were some private schools that were closed. But this is more related to the fact, which also shows that they were not pro-regime, is that they are replacing the regime education with their own education system, which is in Kurdish, Arabic, and also Syriac. But the problem that is because the system is not recognized by Damascus, so they don't have recognition. So there are some people, large part of the population, that are a little bit uneasy with the system because they are afraid if they're going to join these schools that are created by the local administrations, that they're going to lose the future of their children because it's not recognized by Damascus. But there's any Kurdification or something of this kind of claims that there's a Kurdification process because the education is in Syriac, it's in Arabic, it's in Kurdish. There's no Arabs that have to forcefully learn Kurdish or Christians have to forcefully learn Kurdish. But the issue is that Christians and Kurds and also Arabs, they're not very happy with this education system sometimes. It's because it's not recognized by Damascus and they're afraid that, for instance, cannot go to the university in the future because Damascus doesn't allow the teachers. For any teacher that teaches in this education, they will lose their salary. Another thing is the women's rights. I, for instance, one time I had to write a report for a think tank and they asked me to have a gender perspective. But it was very easy to include the gender perspective because everywhere you go in the north and east of Syria, there's like women leaders in all parts of the administrations. So if you go to Raqqa, the co-head is a Kurdish lady, the other co-head is an Arabic tribal leader. And you see this everywhere. So they have this sort of co-chair system that our women are leading everywhere. And moreover, that in the security forces, you also have the female protection units. So they even have like full female brigades that are actively involved in the fight against ISIS. So you don't see that much in the region. I mean, you do have, some people are suggesting, oh, maybe this is just for the picture, this is for the media to gain more attention, but that's not really the case. Like, women are really actively involved in leading this political administration there, and also with the security forces it's the same. And it is also true that in the Arab majority areas, because it's more conservative than the Kurdish areas, that they're a little bit more careful. So for instance, they really, for instance, try to be careful with banning polygamy. They're not banning polygamy, they're not banning child marriages yet in these areas because they know that it will create a lot of resentment among the Arab tribes that say, for instance, there was one Arab tribal leader which was part of the Tabqa Council, and he was telling me, we cannot allow that kind of issues here because this is against Islamic law. So what they decided instead, that in the Arab majority areas they're a little bit more careful with implementing these gender equality rules. So they say we first have to educate the people and maybe in a later stage we could maybe, for instance, ban polygamy or underage marriage. But in the Kurdish areas it is completely banned. So you see that now, for instance, they try to create like women councils in Raqqa, Manbij and other areas, and then try to educate and recruit local Arab women to be included in this system. Then I wanted to say something else. You also have an issue of religious liberty. For instance, in Afrin, you had like churches which completely composed of Kurdish Muslims that converted to Christianity. There was no Christian population in Afrin in the past. And the number of those Christians are a little bit unclear. Some people say it's like around 1,000, some people say it's 500, some people say it's 2,000. But there was like a Christian community of Kurdish Muslims that converted to Christianity. Apart from that, in Afrin, you had Alawites, you had Yazidis, so you had other religious minorities in Afrin. But this completely changed when Turkey invaded in January, and now all those religious minorities, most of them have fled, and there's no more religious freedom. So a lot of people, they really ignore this issue of religious liberty, because you don't have any area in Syria, also not in Damascus, where you can have people that convert to Christianity without having some, because even in Syria there's Islamic law. The Syrian president has to be Muslim according to the constitution. And for instance, I met one man who wanted to convert to Christianity during his wedding with a Christian lady, and then he was actually arrested for 1 month because he said he wanted to convert. And now both of them, they live in Kobani. The Christians that fled Afrin, most of them are now displaced in Shaba, which is in northern Aleppo. Some of them went to Aleppo city, and some of the Christians of Afrin actually are in Istanbul, strangely. But there's no space for religious freedom in the areas controlled by Turkey. I mean, the churches that were there were around 2 churches in Afrin. They're now military headquarters. They were like religious shrines for the Yazidis. I think most people know what the Yazidis are. They are a non-Muslim minority. Most of their shrines there have been destroyed, and now actually they have to follow Islamic education. So the only area where you have actually sort of religious freedom is the north and the east of Syria, but a lot of people actually don't know this. And the reason for that also because the officials in this area themselves, they don't really realize they have this, that they can promote this issue. And as I said before, this education issue has nothing to do with Kurdifying Christians. It's more a thing of non-recognition. So I will talk also a little bit about the policies of Turkey. So in the past, before 2015, Turkey was supporting the overthrow of the Syrian regime. They were supporting rebels to basically attack also the Kurds from creating sort of a land corridor on the border of Turkey. But this policy really didn't work because the Kurds became a major partner against ISIS in 2015 when ISIS attacked Kobani. The reason for that was the rebels were not unified. They had links to Al-Qaeda groups. The rebels were actually unified with ISIS and Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and fighting the regime together in 2013 and 2014. And as a reason of the fight in Kobani, they became partners of the US. So after 2015, also because of the end of the peace process in Turkey, because there used to be a peace process between the Kurdistan Workers' Party and the Turkish government before 2015, it became more difficult, and basically Turkey started to become very nationalist, ultra-nationalist, I could say. Like the AK party now has like an alliance with the ultra-nationalist MHP party, and there's no more hope for any form of peace between the Kurds and the Turks, both in Syria and in Turkey. And there were actually talks. I remember I met Saleh Muslim. He used to be meeting with officials. He met with Hakan Fidan, the Turkish intelligence chief in Turkey in the past. But now after 2015, the goal of Turkey is to destroy the Kurdish-led administrations. And for that reason, when it seemed like that the Kurds were going towards Jarablus and after they controlled Manbij, Turkey launched in August 2016 the Euphrates Shield operation. And the main reason for that was because the Kurds wanted to create this corridor on the Turkish border. They wanted to create like one unified territory, and Turkey wanted to destroy that ability. They wanted to destroy that opportunity for the Kurds, so they launched the Euphrates Shield operation. And recently, in January 2018, they launched the Olive Branch operation. And all the goal was in cooperation actually with the Russians, because they re-established their relation with the Russians In the beginning, the relation between Russia and Turkey was very bad, but Erdogan apologized to Russia. And since then, since Erdogan apologized, even when a Russian diplomat was killed in Turkey, the relations between Turkey and Russia stayed quite good. And this relation until now was continuing. And Russia is actually using Ankara now to weaken the Syrian Kurds. So how Russia is doing that? We saw in Afrin when Turkey threatened to attack Afrin, Russia told the administration in Afrin, if you now accept the regime full control of Afrin, then Turkey will not attack. So actually, until now, Russia was using that. So that's why Russia was recently also supporting Turkey possibly attacking Tel Abyad or Manbij or Kobani, because Russia was thinking that if, for instance, the Turks will attack this area, then the Kurds might seek help from Assad. And they might accept some control of Assad over the northeast of Syria. So Russia is using this to not to only create instability, because Turkey is a NATO ally. So for Russia, it's very much in their benefit to have problems between Turkey, the US, and the West. So Russia is playing that very well. And that's why in Idlib there's now sort of a safe zone for jihadists. Because Turkey and Russia, they made a deal to not allow Assad to attack Idlib. And the reason for that, because it's in Russia, now Idlib is sort of under control. Those groups are mostly fighting each other, the moderate rebels versus the jihadists in Idlib. And for Russia, this is in their benefit because this is no more threat to Assad. And at the same time, Turkey is creating instability by attacking or possibly attacking the northeast of Syria. So yeah, I talked about Turkey before. I mean, there's also a lot of ignorance about Turkey, what they were doing in the past. I mean, all the jihadists that came to Syria, they passed with Turkish stamps on their passport to Syria. And then later, when ISIS came, Turkey was not really interested in fighting ISIS because, for instance, when Tel Abyad, an Arabic town, was under ISIS control, the border gate of Tel Abyad was open. But after the YPG took control of Tel Abyad, Turkey closed the border, and actually they just started fighting ISIS in August 2016, because they realized if they didn't fight ISIS themselves, then the Kurds would use this opportunity to create this sort of land corridor on the Turkish border. And Turkey was really afraid of that. They really don't want this Rojava model to succeed, because they're afraid that this could, for instance, also be a threat and inspire, for instance, Kurds in Turkey. And even recently in Idlib, there was a lot of coordination between Al-Qaeda and Turkey, because Turkish military, they established observation points in Idlib, and they were escorted by Tahrir al-Tahrir Sham, which is basically the Al-Qaeda affiliate. And I talked to an Afrin civilian that tried to smuggle himself to Turkey, and he was actually arrested on the Turkish border and handed over to the Al-Qaeda affiliate. So Turkey doesn't really see Al-Qaeda and ISIS as like a security threat. They see the YPG and the SDF as a security threat, because they're afraid that this could possibly, be a threat for them in the future in Turkey. And there was actually a report by the Dutch intelligence that were saying that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are now able to reorganize in Turkey because Turkey is only focused on the Kurdistan Workers' Party. They're not so much focused on jihadists, they are focused on the Kurds. And now, because Idlib is also sort of safe for Al-Qaeda, they're able to reorganize there, and also there are other extremist groups in other areas under Turkish control. And even when Turkey attacked Afrin, the Syrian Democratic Forces were forced to stop their offensive on ISIS in Haji, which made it also able for a short period of time for ISIS to reorganize. So when I was still in Syria, Turkey was planning to attack Tel Abyad especially. So it's difficult now to show you the geography of northeast of Syria, because I don't have a map behind me. But basically, so you have the northeast of Syria, you have Afrin, Kobani, and Jazeera, where you have Kurdish enclaves. And then the rest of it is more mixed with Arabs, Kurds, Turkmen, and other areas. So what the aim was of Turkey, they already took control of Afrin in March 2018. What they wanted was to take Tel Abyad, which is sort of the center between Kobani and between Jazeera. And if Turks control Tel Abyad, they can push more forward towards Raqqa, and they would basically split Kobani and the Jazeera canton. So they have two administrations here in Kobani and one in the Hasaka province. And if Turkey would slice this through, then it will not be able to have a connection between these two areas. But then US told the rebels, which I got also confirmed by US soldiers, if you're gonna attack, we see a lot of Western journalists, they're always talking about Raqqa, civilians were killed by airstrikes in Raqqa, but we don't see a lot of focus on what's going on in Afrin. Because one of the issues of the Western media is they only focus on the US-backed areas. So if there's just one small thing going on in Raqqa and Kobani or Tel Abyad, it's really exaggerated in the media. There's a lot of focus on that. But if something is happening in the Euphrates Shield areas, on the Turkey or the Olive Branch areas, there's almost no media attention for that. The reason is, first of all, there's almost no Western journalist that is going to these areas. There's no access. If you write anything critical about that, you will be banned from Turkey, or you will not be able to visit these areas. Most of all, these areas are not very safe because the threat of kidnapping. For instance, I met one journalist in Kamishli recently who was kidnapped by his own fixer, who later joined the Turkish-backed rebels to fight against the Kurds and ISIS in the Euphrates Shield operation. So the situation in Afrin is really very horrible because, like, first of all, when Turkey took Afrin, the whole Afrin was looted. It was completely looted, it was completely emptied. Then after that, there were actually some civilians that thought it was a good idea to return to Afrin. So Afrin is a Kurdish majority area. It's full of people now from other areas of Syria. They were saying that everywhere they go, they get arrested, and then they are forced to pay money. So they get arrested by one group, then they get arrested by another group, they get arrested by another group, until they run out of money, and then they leave the area. If, for instance, the Kurdish-led forces in Raqqa started to loot and kidnap civilians for money, it will cause like a huge outrage, and there will be media reports in The Guardian tomorrow, it will be in the Washington Post, there will be a lot of reports. But if something like that is happening in Afrin, there's almost no media coverage. So there's a lot of things going on in Afrin, but people don't know about it because they're not trying to interview people from Afrin. I mean, I talked to people for instance, I talked to one civilian. His brother was killed in an airstrike, and there were civilians killed in that airstrike. Turkey arrested him, the Turkish army arrested him. Then they say, if you don't tell us that you're YPG and that the civilians were PKK, we're going to keep you in prison. So what happened? He went to like 2-3 days in a Turkish prison. He didn't want to confess that he was PKK. And then he was like several months and tortured in a rebel held prison in Azaz. What they just wanted to do, because he witnessed that civilians were killed by a Turkish airstrike, they just wanted to force him to say that he is PKK. And he was just a civilian. He didn't say he was PKK. So eventually he was released after a lot of torture, after being months in prison in Azaz. And he's just like one case of civilians being tortured and kidnapped. So what mostly happens with civilians when they get arrested, they first go to Turkey for 2 days. They spend some time in a Turkish prison, like 2 days. And then they are sent to a prison in Azaz or in Al-Rai, which is both in areas held by Turkey. And then the torture continues. Either they pay, for instance, bribes to be released, or they get released after a long time of torture. And even in these areas, like in Afrin, I mean, there used to be Yazidis there, there used to be Alawites there, there used to be Christians there. All that like now is gone. Like there's no more space for any religious freedom. And sadly, there's not a lot of focus on this. And if, for instance, Raqqa or something, they would do something like that, there would be a huge outrage. And for instance, even they are restoring the churches. Actually, there's a church in Tel Abyad, they're restoring it. There's a church in Raqqa, they were restoring it. But that's now all gone. So now I'm going to get to Trump's decision to withdraw. This decision is not, so there was a statement today by the White House. There was a tweet by Donald Trump that the fight against ISIS is over. He was only staying in Syria because of the fight against ISIS. Who made this decision by Trump now that they say they're gonna withdraw? This is not a decision by the State Department. This is not a decision supported by the Pentagon. This is solely a decision by Trump because this is about domestic issues. Maybe he wants to do this for his own because he promised the people in the past that he's gonna not put US soldiers in foreign conflicts. This has nothing to do also with the new policy of the Syrian envoy, because the Syrian envoy actually had a new policy. There was a new Syrian envoy, James Jeffrey. He said, we're going to stay in Syria until Iranian forces leave, until there's like a working Geneva process, until Iranian forces basically leave. But also what he wanted to do James Jeffrey wanted to use the northeast of Syria because there's a lot of oil and gas resources. There's oil and gas resources in Deir ez-Zor. There's a lot of agriculture in northeast of Syria. Actually, the northeast of Syria used to be the fruit or agricultural basket for all of Syria. So what James Jeffrey wanted to do was appointed like not a long time ago. What he wanted to do was using this northeast of Syria to deny the Syrian regime these resources and to force the Syrian regime to the negotiation table. But now that Trump wants to withdraw, the US and the rest of the West, France, UK, other countries, will have no more leverage at all to have any pressure on the regime to give any concession. So the Western leverage will be completely gone. This is also not a policy of the US-led coalition or the Pentagon. Like the US Army wants to stay because they know that, for instance, from Obama, when Obama withdrew from Iraq, a few years later, ISIS took 1/3 of Iraq. And actually, sometimes Trump was saying, like, we're not gonna do the same as Obama, but now he's doing the same, even worse than Obama. He's saying he's gonna just completely withdraw without doing anything else. So this is not like a decision of the State Department, it's not a decision of the Pentagon. James Jeffrey is seen by a lot of people as a sort of pro-Turkish person, but at the same time he wanted to make both Turkey sort of happy by making some administrative changes. For instance, bringing Turkish-backed politicians to the Raqqa Council, the Manbij Council, bringing some people from Turkish-backed groups to the northeast of Syria. But the policy of Jeffrey was not to just completely leave northeast of Syria and letting either regime or Iran taking this area over. So who will benefit from such a decision to completely withdraw? According to the latest information, the State Department is pulling out in 24 hours. The US Army will pull out in 60 to 100 days completely. So this will lead to like a lot of displacement from all the civilians that are living in Kobani, living in Jazeera and Hasaka. They will be displaced. I don't know where they can go to. I have no idea. Possibly they could create like a new refugee crisis for the KRG, which already has a lot of issues. KRG already was hosting over 1 million IDPs and refugees in Iraqi Kurdistan. So it could possibly result in a major crisis because Turkey will possibly attack, the regime will attack. So it will create like a huge crisis. ISIS also is not defeated yet. I mean, there's still a large number of ISIS fighters according to intelligence estimates and Pentagon estimates. The Hajin battle is still not finished. I think it's impossible. I don't see why the Syrian Democratic Forces would fight against ISIS in Hajin when they know that the US Army will pull out in 60 or 100 days. So it's going to create like a huge chaos in the northeast of Syria. It will leave the West without any leverage over the Syrian regime because they were trying to use this area to have like some form of leverage over the regime. But if you don't control any territory in Syria, if you don't have any de facto power on the ground, then what's the point of Damascus to talk to you when they can just take over this area? So it's going to completely undermine the policy of James Jeffrey. It's going to undermine the coalition policy because ISIS is not destroyed yet. And it's going to create like a lot of security issues. Why Trump is making this decision, I'm not sure. Probably because he has his domestic consideration. He wants to build a wall. He's focused on his wall. He wants to get money for the wall, and maybe that's why I think he's going to get some money by pulling out or something. I'm not necessarily sure. I mean, the only way actually now for the northeast of Syria is to survive is, for instance, if the French, which also have a military presence in the northeast of Syria, Jordan maybe, the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, that they maybe pull some forces to stop a possible regime advance or Turkish attack on these areas. The other option would be for basically the Kurds to have sort of a deal with the regime, to put like regime forces on the border of the northeast of Syria. But the problem is that the regime will probably will demand a full control of the northeast of Syria because the policy of Russia and the regime is to regain full control over Syria. And if all these oil and gas resources in Deir ez-Zor and Hakli Omar and coconut oil fields in Deir ez-Zor are under control of the regime, they can have some money again to rebuild, to reconstruct the areas that they took control over of the Syrian opposition. and it will completely undermine Western policy, because the Western policy was never completely overthrowing Assad by, for instance, killing Assad, but they always supported the Syrian opposition. But the Syrian opposition is basically now under control of Turkey, so it's basically the annexation of a part of Syria by Turkey, like what happened in Cyprus. The time zone is different in these areas. They have Turkish ID cards, they have Turkish lira, they have Turkish post offices. So if Turkey is saying that they're in favor of the unity of Syria or against the partition of Syria, this is completely not true. This is another Ottoman project to occupy a part of Syria. There's no way, actually the SDF in the northeast of Syria, they have a project which is more in favor of the unity of Syria, because they're willing to negotiate with Damascus to have some form of autonomous status in the northeast of Syria. But if Trump really decides to withdraw completely, I think this area will be under complete threat, and this religious liberty, the safety for NGOs to operate in this area freely, for journalists to enter this area freely, is completely gone. And it will result in a major chaos, refugee flows, ISIS resurgence, will benefit Iran, will benefit Russia, will destroy all this progress they made with building women's rights. Those Christians that fled, they will probably have no place to go to, because most of the Christians from Afrin that converted to Christianity that are now in displacement camps in Shaba area, maybe they will be forced also to flee. Where they're gonna go to, I have no idea. It's also going to be very dangerous for the Iraqi Kurds, because first of all the refugee crisis is going to create another refugee crisis. I know that Europe is not very critical of Turkey, because Turkey always threatens to send millions of refugees to Europe. But this can also create another crisis of a lot of refugees, of Kurds, Arabs and others in these areas. It'll also be like, if Trump really is going to do this, it's going to be the case, who's going to attack first? Will it be Turkey? Will it be the regime in Iran and Russia? But also it's dangerous for the Iraqi Kurds, because one of the reasons that Fishkhabur, which is the point if your journalist, aid workers cross into Syria from Iraqi Kurdistan into Syria, after the independence referendum in October 2000, not in October, in September, but when the Iraqi forces wanted to advance, one of their main goals was to take the Fishkhabur area, which I cannot show you, but you have this Iraqi Kurdistan here. So here you have this point. Here's the Turkish border, here's the Iranian border. Here you have Fishkhabur. If Iraq and Turkey manage to control this corridor, then basically the KRG will have no more, like basically there will be an alternative to the KRG's border crossings with Turkey. And then Iraq can do trade and oil trade with Turkey directly, and they don't need Iraqi Kurds anymore. So then the Iraqi Kurds will be very weak and vulnerable. This was the plan of the Iraqis after the referendum in 2017 in October, but the US stopped this because Fishkhabur is a major hub for military support and also aid support for the northeast of Syria. But when the northeast of Syria is not anymore there anymore, then what would be the benefit of the US to keep supporting Fishkhabur? So this could be another incentive maybe for Baghdad and Turkey to cut off this small pocket, which makes the Iraqi Kurds dependent on Baghdad and Ankara, which also creates instability and a disbalance in the region. I'm not very optimistic now about the future of the northeast of Syria because of this Trump decision to withdraw. And I hope this made a lot of sense, because it's quite complicated with Iran, Turkey, Syria, Trump. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.